Professor Halvek stood before the assembled cadets of the Galactic Academy, his 4 crystalline eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who had spent 3 centuries studying extinct civilizations. The lecture hall, a magnificent dome of transparent alloy floating above the capital world of the Concordance, held students from 73 species. They sat in rows designed to accommodate everything from the gaseous Valorum to the 12-limbed Krethax. And so, Halvek continued, his translator converting his resonant frequencies into comprehensible speech, we arrive at the most fascinating extinction event in recent galactic history. The Terrans, or as they called themselves, humans. A hologram materialized above his teaching podium, displaying a rotating blue-green world. Several students leaned forward with interest. Extinction studies were always popular, offering cautionary tales about hubris, environmental collapse, or the ever-present dangers of first contact gone wrong. This species, Halvek said, gesturing at the planet with one of his primary appendages, represents perhaps the most lethal sapient race ever documented in Concordance records. In a mere 2,000 years of recorded history, they engaged in over 15,000 armed conflicts. They developed nuclear weaponry within a century of achieving industrial civilization. They poisoned their own atmosphere, decimated their biosphere, and yet somehow, he paused for effect. They reached for the stars anyway. A Valorum student, barely visible as a shimmer in its containment field, pulsed a question through its translator. Professor, what ultimately destroyed them? Themselves, of course, Halvek replied, with what might have been his species' equivalent of a satisfied smile. The records showed that approximately 200 standard cycles ago, their transmission simply stopped. When our survey vessels finally reached their system 70 cycles later, we found a silent world. No cities, no satellites, no signs of life beyond primitive microorganisms. The humans had done what they did best, they had eliminated themselves. In the back row, partially obscured by a towering Krethax cadet, a small figure raised her hand. Halvek, deep into his rhythm, didn't notice. The lesson here is clear. A species that glorifies combat, that produces entertainment about warfare, that actually wrote manuals on how to most efficiently eliminate their own kind. Such a species carries the seeds of its own destruction. We must learn from— Excuse me, Professor. The voice was soft but clear, carrying a strange quality that made several students turn. It came from that raised hand in the back. Halvek's crystalline eyes rotated to focus on the speaker. Yes, Cadet? Solon. Mira Solon. The figure stood and Halvek noticed for the first time the unusual characteristics. Bilateral symmetry, 2 eyes. Skin instead of scales, chitin or energy fields. Hair. Actual protein strands growing from the cranium. I'm afraid there's been an error in your data, Professor. An error? Halvek's tone carried amusement. The other students made various species-specific sounds of interest. Cadet Solon, I have been teaching xenohistory for 3 centuries. My sources include the Concordance Central Archives, survey data from the Terra system, and— It's called Earth, sir. Silence fell across the lecture hall like a physical force. What? Mira Solon walked down the steps toward the front, her movements displaying that peculiar grace that came from evolving on a high-gravity world. The planet. We don't call it Terra, we call it Earth. And as for humans being extinct, she smiled, and several nearby students instinctively drew back. There was something in that expression, something that showed too many teeth. I'm afraid that's premature, Professor. Halvek's crystalline structure began to shift colors, a sign of confusion in his species. You're claiming to be human? Not claiming, Sir M. Mira reached the front row and gestured to the hologram of Earth. May I? Too stunned to object, Halvek simply rotated 2 eyes toward her in assent. Mira manipulated the controls and the hologram zoomed in, past the cloud layers, down to the surface. But instead of the barren wasteland Halvek had described, the image showed sprawling cities, green spaces, gleaming spires reaching into the atmosphere, and orbital structures that definitely hadn't been there in the old survey data. You see, Professor, your survey team arrived during what we call the Great Silence. For 3 generations, humanity made a collective decision. After nearly destroying ourselves, you were right about that part. We chose to go dark. No broadcasts. No signals. We focused inward, Fixing our world, fixing ourselves. We let the galaxy think we were gone. She turned to face the assembled cadets and her smile widened. But we weren't gone. We were learning, building, preparing. And 70 cycles ago, right around the time your survey vessels were discovering our extinct civilization, we were actually establishing our first extrasolar colonies. Quietly, carefully. Halvek's colors had shifted to something that might have been alarm. The Concordance has protocols. First contact procedures. You can't simply, can't we? Mira's voice remained pleasant, but there was an edge to it now. Professor, you just spent an hour teaching these cadets that humans were the most lethal species in recorded history. Did you think that lethality came from stupidity? We learned to be quiet. We learned to watch. We learned to wait. She pulled out a small device, a human data pad, and projected new images into the air. Star systems, colonies, ships of designs unknown to Concordance databases. There are currently 147 human colony worlds, Professor. 32 of them in what the Concordance considers its own territory. You just didn't notice us. We learned how to hide in plain sight. The lecture hall had become absolutely silent. Even the Valorum had stopped its constant shimmer. Why? The question came from a Krethax student, its dozen limbs trembling slightly. Why hide? Why wait? Mira turned to face the questioner and her expression softened slightly. Because we learned, friend. We learned that the most dangerous human isn't the one charging into battle. It's the one who knows when to wait, when to watch, when to prepare. She looked back at Halvek. We looked at the galaxy and saw the Concordance, peaceful, prosperous, complacent. We saw how they treated news of extinct species, how they cataloged and archived and moved on. And we thought, what better way to join the galactic community than as a surprise? She walked back toward her seat, pausing halfway up the stairs. As for being lethal, Professor, you were right about that too, but you missed the most important part of that lesson. The most lethal species isn't the one that fights constantly. It's the one that knows how to stop fighting long enough to win. Mira sat down, leaving Professor Halvek standing at his podium, his crystalline structure cycling through colors that suggested profound confusion, a touch of fear, and perhaps, though he would never admit it, a hint of respect. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Halvek managed to speak. Well then, Cadet Solon, perhaps you'd like to provide the rest of today's lecture on human civilization? Mira's smile returned, warmer now. No thank you, Professor. I think watching the galaxy discover we're still here is going to be education enough, for all of us. And in the silence that followed, 73 species began to recalculate what they thought they knew about humanity. While across the galaxy, on 147 worlds, humans continued doing what they did best, surviving, thriving, and waiting for precisely the right moment to make their presence known. The lesson, as it turned out, was just beginning.